Here's a thought experiment. If Marxist ethics could be proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt that it was logically deduced from first principles and was valid, sound, and objective, would you gleefully starve in a breadline? In previous videos and podcasts, I have explained my contention with the non-aggression principle as an ethical axiom. I will not be rehashing those arguments here. If you are interested in my critiques of the non-aggression principle, I will link in the description box a podcast I did with MK Lords, and also a video by Trudeau Tom, which I mostly agree with. It is not to say that I think the state is justified or that murder, theft, and fraud are good. It's just that I think that the NAP is insufficient as a moral axiom. However, in this video, I will be assuming largely that the non-aggression principle is correct, but I don't believe that the NAP is a very compelling case for libertarianism.
So, people say, well, how will poor kids be educated? And who will build the roads? And how will there be national defense? And how will children be protected? And blah, 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 blah. And I'm sad to say that these questions don't matter at all. Completely irrelevant to the fundamental question. I know that may sound shocking. Statism is a violation of the non-aggression principle. Thou shalt not steal doesn't change if you have a little business card from the IRS. It doesn't change. So the question of how things will be achieved in the absence of the state, how social goods will be provided in the absence of the state, doesn't matter.
Many libertarians come to the conclusion that the non-aggression principle is logically consistent and logically deduced from first principles, and that to try to argue from consequentialism is not helpful or persuasive, that attempting to argue from any sort of empirical data is mostly a waste of time, or not as useful as arguing from the non-aggression principle, because people will still find reasons to object or deflect to other perceived problems. Even still, you will still find a lot of them bringing up empirical data when discussing libertarianism with non-libertarians. Sure, you could say that this is fine, but it's a bit of a contradiction in some cases, but this is not my objection. My objection is the reason they keep having to devolve into consequentialism and empiricism anyway. This demonstrates the failure of ethical arguments to push an ideology. For a time when I was an NAP evangelist, I would argue for libertarianism through ethics. The objections were always about how such a society would function, and how to deal with crime, poverty, warring nations, and most importantly, the roads. Sure, that seems like a great idea, they would say, but what if the society would be a total hellhole? It's a good point. So like I said in the intro to my video, theoretically, if Marxist ethics could be proven to you beyond a reasonable doubt, if it was logically deduced from first principles and was valid, sound, and objective, would you gleefully starve in a breadline? This poses a serious conundrum for ethical arguments for any ideology. Let's assume that any ethical system proposed a perfect system of ethics and a logical and rational framework. What if it implemented a society that resulted in serious issues like endless domestic war, mass poverty, fallouts from famine, rampant crime, etc.? Sure, the construction of such a society would be ethical, but there would be serious issues that would make living there a living nightmare. These other ideological systems and their ethical prescriptions do come from a very deep understanding of logic and philosophy. To assume that libertarians have a monopoly on these things is extremely ignorant. Sure, we can try to poke holes in them, but people do try and do the same for the non-aggression principle. Now, obviously, I don't believe that such a society founded on the non-aggression principle would be catastrophic. Quite the contrary. I think it would be a large improvement compared to any other system that has been implemented before, even though I have some critiques about the reasoning. However, even when I was making my transition from being a progressive to a nappy libertarian, I still needed to know how such a society would work and if it would work better than the system that I currently advocated for. Most people, when you tell them about the non-aggression principle, they like it, but they are okay with making some rights violations as a trade-off to protect themselves from more or bigger rights violations. Like, they're okay with being stolen from a little bit to protect themselves with police from people who will rob them blind and or kill them. It's a more persuasive argument to make to explain why the police aren't necessary and that they don't do a very good job of protecting you, and that your proposal will be better at preventing such a scenario. Or explain that cops are usually the ones that rob you blind and kill you, but moving along.
And it's also unnecessary and counterproductive when it comes to trying to convince people who are not of a very select type. There's a very select type of person who places a high value on abstract thinking and rigorous, consistent philosophical adherence. And for that 1% of the population, the NAP is a potentially very, very convincing argument. Most people do not respond to esoteric arguments that are based on really conceptual ideas.
There is this Myers-Briggs test. Have you heard of that?
Briefly, but I'm not totally familiar what it is.
Like a psychological thing, and it divides people into 16 groups in terms of their intellectual way of looking at things, in terms of their emotions and what have you. And it was determined that like 3 or 4% of all people in the United States are the ABC group, whatever the ABC group, and that virtually all libertarians were in the ABC group. ABC is wrong. I'm just saying one small group of the Myers-Briggs. And that's why we libertarians are having such trouble converting the masses to libertarianism, because we're all in one small sector of the psychology. But I agree with you entirely. But I don't think Murray's article is saying we should only be deontologists, that we shouldn't use utilitarian arguments. He's saying that for him, the deontology is more important. And I agree personally, the deontology is much more clear. But I don't think Murray says there or anywhere else that we shouldn't use utilitarian arguments. We shouldn't say, well, when you have a minimum wage, it creates unemployment for unskilled workers, and this is a horrible thing, and offer some statistical evidence for it, like the sort of statistical evidence I was offering for the male-female wage gap. You'd have to quote me something from this article that is your least favorite article, where Murray comes out against utilitarian libertarianism.
Now, I am not saying that ethics shouldn't be discussed by people who think that it's important to talk about. There's still a small percentage of people who those types of arguments and those types of arguments alone are enough for them to drop their cognitive defenses enough to look further into them. But the idea that consequentialist arguments or that how things might work in a free society don't matter, and that all that really matters is ethics, is very myopic. Now, there's good evidence to show that people pointing out about 6 issues with any system is enough for anyone to reconsider their worldview, not just one, and not just one that only appeals to a very small subset of people. But stay away from the roads. We all know that that's the real linchpin of libertarianism. Hail Satan.